Alex Grant, 30, has been working as a night security guard at Horizon Mart for almost 5 years. As a local guy, Alex lives just a few miles from the superstore in a quiet suburban area where the hustle and bustle of the day often fades by midnight. He's no stranger to the monotony that comes with working the graveyard shift, spending long, lonely hours walking the aisles, checking the cameras, and occasionally helping out with routine store maintenance. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays the bills. The quiet nights suit him no drama, just a predictable routine that's easy to slip into. Alex is the type of person who doesn't get easily rattled. His job doesn't involve chasing down criminals or making big decisions. Instead, he's focused on the small tasks, making sure no one sneaks in after hours, securing the building, and keeping an eye on the parking lot, which, while mostly empty at night, occasionally draws some less than savory characters. He's seen it all before: drifters pulling in for the night cars with suspiciously dark windows, even the occasional teenager trying to steal a shopping cart. But Alex isn't a rookie. He's seen plenty of sketchy stuff and knows how to keep his cool. He isn't interested in getting involved in anything unless it's a clear threat. It's all about keeping the store safe and getting through the night. He isn't a superhero, just a regular guy doing his job. Yet there's a side of him that's always alert, always watching, but also willing to ignore what doesn't immediately demand action. In the back of his mind, he's thinking about the same thing every night. Get through the shift, go home, and try not to let the isolation get to him too much. Horizon Mart is located on the outskirts of a quiet suburban town where the hum of everyday life fades as night falls. The sprawling parking lot, typical of large superstores, seems almost endless under the dim lights, with only a handful of cars dotting the pavement. The building itself is a massive structure, often eerily still after hours, save for the soft buzz of fluorescent lights inside. For Alex, this environment is both a comfort and a challenge. By 2 a.m., the place is a ghost town, with only the occasional delivery truck or a few lone shoppers lingering. But it's the vast emptiness of the parking lot that truly marks the shift in his routine. The lot is his domain for the night, an expansive, quiet space where he spends most of his time circling the perimeter, checking cameras, and making sure nothing out of the ordinary is happening. The distant city lights offer no real warmth, and the cold concrete beneath his boots feels like a constant reminder of the isolation that comes with his job. The air is thick with silence, except for the occasional squeak of the security door and the muffled sound of the building's HVAC system. Despite the tranquility, Alex knows better than to become too comfortable. The dark corners of the lot have hidden their fair share of trouble, whether it's a teenager loitering or something far worse. While most of his nights pass without incident, Alex stays vigilant, ready to respond if the unexpected ever disrupts the quiet. The shift had started like any other, predictable and quiet. Alex had just clocked in and was settling into his usual routine, checking the cameras and doing a quick sweep of the building. With the store closed and the only sound being the hum of the air conditioning, it was easy to let the mind wander. He knew the lot like the back of his hand, each pothole, each flickering light, each corner where trouble might hide. At around 2 a.m., he decided to take his usual smoke break, stepping outside to the emergency exit by the auto care center. The cold night air hit him immediately, a welcome contrast to the sterile indoor climate. Standing against the wall, he took a long drag, watching the empty lot stretch out before him. The few cars left in the lot seemed far away, almost ghostly under the weak lights. The RVs parked at the far end. The occasional rusted sedan were nothing out of the ordinary. Alex had seen it all: the wandering drifters, late-night mechanics, and kids sneaking around, but nothing ever really happened. Most of the time, the parking lot was a peaceful, if not somewhat desolate place. But tonight felt different. As Alex exhaled a cloud of smoke, his gaze fell on 2 cars parked at the farthest edge of the lot, positioned close together, as though they were conducting some sort of exchange. There were 3 men standing around the SUV, low voices carrying in the otherwise still night. They were moving in a way that made Alex's instincts tingle. Something wasn't right. He kept his distance knowing better than to jump to conclusions, but his curiosity got the best of him. As he watched, the situation escalated, and it wasn't long before Alex knew he was witnessing something far darker than a routine transaction. Alex's gaze stayed fixed on the two cars parked near the farthest corner of the lot. The way they were backed up against each other trunk to trunk was unusual. Something felt off. He'd seen enough late-night transactions to recognize the patterns, but this one felt different. The men gathered around the SUV weren't acting like they were making a quick exchange. They were far too cautious, looking over their shoulders, constantly whispering in low voices. Alex's gut told him something wasn't right, but he had no reason to assume the worst just yet. He leaned against the wall, keeping his distance, but still close enough to keep an eye on them. From the moment he spotted the group, he could tell there was something sinister about the way they moved. One man lingered near the sedan, barely visible in the shadows, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his hoodie. The other two were closer to the SUV, exchanging gestures that Alex couldn't quite make out, but they were too deliberate, too guarded. Alex had been a security guard long enough to know when to back off and let things play out, but tonight he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a petty deal. He watched the men closely, trying to make sense of their movements, but the further they went on, the more intense the situation seemed. The one closest to the trunk of the SUV bent over to peer inside, his body language casual, as if inspecting something. That's when things took a sharp turn. Out of nowhere, one of the men pulled something from behind his back, a large bag or cloth. It wasn't clear, and threw it over the other's head in a swift motion. The man stood frozen for a moment, and before Alex could fully process what was happening, the man standing by the trunk lunged forward. In a flash, Alex watched in horror as the man began stabbing the other repeatedly, the motion quick and brutal. The victim stumbled backward, struggling for a moment before collapsing into the trunk, his body lifeless. Alex's heart hammered in his chest, and his mind raced. It had all happened so fast, too fast. The men didn't seem to hesitate, as if this was routine. The shock of it hit him hard, his hands shaking as he realized he had just witnessed a murder. He could barely breathe, and before he knew it, the SUV's engine roared to life, the red taillights disappearing into the night. It all happened in the span of seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. Alex stood frozen, the weight of what he had just seen settling heavily on his chest. Alex's heart raced as he stood frozen in the dim light, his cigarette dangling between his fingers, forgotten. His mind struggled to catch up with what he had just witnessed. The image of the man being stabbed repeatedly, his body crumpling to the ground before being tossed into the trunk, burned into Alex's mind. He had always known that working the overnight shift at Horizon Mart came with its share of bizarre incidents, but nothing had prepared him for something like this. He felt the familiar chill of panic creep up his spine. For a split second, Alex considered running outside to help, but what good would it do? He had no weapon, no training to stop a violent attack like that. The reality of the situation hit him harder than anything he had ever experienced in his years of watching over the store. The thought of what he had just seen made his stomach turn. His mind reeled with questions. Who were these men? What had the victim done to deserve such brutality? Was it a gang thing, a drug deal gone wrong? But there were no answers. Only the haunting image of the bloodless scene he had just watched unfold. All of it had happened so quickly in a blur of movement. There had been no struggle, no time for the man to defend himself. It was as if they had been prepared for it, as though this kind of violence was a routine part of their lives. Alex's feet finally moved almost by instinct, as his mind screamed for him to get inside to call for help. The weight of the decision to report the crime pressed down on him. He bolted for the emergency exit, his mind still locked on the events he had just witnessed. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his hands trembled so badly that he could barely manage to close the door behind him. The faint sound of screeching tires echoed from the parking lot, and he caught a glimpse of the red tail lights fading into the darkness. It was over, but Alex knew it wasn't. What had just happened? wasn't something that could easily be forgotten. Inside, he barely registered Mark's confused expression as he rushed to the desk. "Call the cops!" Alex managed to gasp. His voice was hoarse, his words trembling. Mark, still caught in the haze of his phone screen, barely understood at first. When the panic set in, Alex repeated himself, the urgency in his voice clear. It was only then that Mark seemed to snap to attention, dialing 911 with shaky hands. The next few minutes felt like a blur to Alex as he recounted what he had seen. The image of the man stabbed and discarded like a piece of trash kept replaying in his mind. It was all he could see. What was he supposed to do now? How was he supposed to go back to a normal shift after this? There was no going back to the same routine. It had all changed in a single instant. Alex's mind was a whirlwind as he paced the small security office, his hands still trembling from what he had just witnessed. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a cold, paralyzing fear. His thoughts were a tangled mess of questions and doubts, none of which he had answers to. What had just happened? Who were those men? Why had they chosen that moment to end someone's life so casually, so violently? His stomach churned, and he felt a knot tightening in his chest. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He couldn't shake the image of the man stabbed so quickly, his life snuffed out with a brutal efficiency that Alex couldn't comprehend. The violent motion, the speed of it all left no room for hesitation or mercy. It had been swift and final. Alex replayed it over and over in his mind, as if he could somehow make sense of it. But every time the same terror gripped him, the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had seen a murder, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His job didn't prepare him for something like this. What was he supposed to do? Charge out into the parking lot with his flashlight? His radio was useless for something like this. The cops were the only ones who could handle it, but they were already late. Alex's breathing was shallow as he sank into the chair, his eyes staring at the monitor in front of him, though he couldn't focus on anything. The hum of the security cameras felt like it was echoing in his ears, but there was no comfort in their quiet routine anymore. The silence had turned heavy, suffocating. He had watched a life end, and now he had to live with the weight of that moment. The worst part? He still didn't know what to do with himself. Would he go back to work tomorrow like nothing happened? Would he ever be the same? His shift wasn't over, but it felt like everything had already changed. The minutes dragged on in a haze of confusion and dread. Alex sat in the dimly lit office, his mind racing but unable to land on any coherent thought. Mark had called the police, but by the time the officers arrived, the chaos in Alex's head was far more overwhelming than anything outside. The police asked all of the right questions. How many people were involved? What the suspect looked like? Did he see any weapons or hear any names? But none of Alex's answers felt right. He could barely remember the details. Everything had happened so quickly, and his mind had struggled to keep up. He couldn't make out faces, didn't get a good look at the cars, and certainly didn't hear anything over the pounding of his heart. The only thing that stood out was the violence, how quick and brutal it had been. He couldn't offer anything substantial, nothing that would help them catch the culprits. The security footage from the cameras barely showed anything useful, blurry, grainy images that only captured vague shapes moving through the night. The officers seemed disappointed, but polite, taking a copy of the footage and combing through the rest of the parking lot for evidence. They even checked the sedan, but it was empty, and nothing stood out. Alex felt useless, trapped in a reality where he had seen something horrifying and couldn't make sense of it, couldn't stop it, and now couldn't even help solve it. The cops were frustrated, but didn't direct their anger at him. They understood he had only seen part of it, that he wasn't trained for this kind of situation. But for Alex, that wasn't much comfort. He kept thinking, was I supposed to have done something more? Could I have helped? The helplessness gnawed at him. He had just witnessed a man die in the most sudden and shocking way, and yet the system, the police, everything seemed so disconnected from his experience. The case would be filed away, and life would go on. But Alex knew he wouldn't be able to forget what happened that night. The following days felt like a blur for Alex. He tried to carry on with his shifts, as if nothing had happened, but it was impossible. Each night he walked the aisles of Horizon Mart, checked the cameras, and glanced out at the parking lot. But the weight of what he had witnessed hung over him like a dark cloud. The silence that once felt peaceful now felt suffocating. Even when the store was empty, when the only noise was the hum of the fluorescent lights, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The parking lot was just a parking lot, but now it was a place where a life had been taken in front of his eyes. The space that had been so familiar, so ordinary, now felt like a haunting reminder of the night's events. He couldn't stop replaying it, how fast it all happened, the way the man was stabbed without warning, the way his body was tossed away like it didn't matter. The images kept flashing in his mind at the most unexpected moments. When he tried to sleep, they came to him in his dreams. When he took a break to grab a coffee, they were there lurking in the background. His mind raced with the same questions he couldn't answer. Who were those men? What was this all about? Was the victim someone who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, or was this some kind of gang-related hit? The worst part was the nagging sense of guilt. Alex felt like he should have done something, anything to stop it. But deep down, he knew that his role as a security guard didn't prepare him for something like this. He wasn't equipped to handle violence on that scale. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't armed. He was just a guy in a uniform trying to get through the night. But that didn't stop him from wondering if he could have reacted differently. He should have called the police sooner, maybe even tried to intervene. But the reality was, by the time he'd realized what was happening, it was already too late. The lack of closure from the police investigation only made things worse. Despite their best efforts, the case seemed to go nowhere. No arrests, no leads, and Alex was left with nothing but a vague sense of unease. The incident had become just another case in a city full of them, filed away in a police report. But for Alex, it wasn't just another night. It was a night that had changed him, and no matter how hard he tried to shake the images from his mind, he knew they would stay with him forever. Every night, when Alex returned to his shift, the parking lot outside seemed just as quiet as before, but now it no longer felt like a peaceful place. The images of that night never left his mind. He continued with his job, but the haunting memory lingered like a ghost he couldn't shake. The police couldn't uncover anything new, and life seemed to go back to normal. But for Alex, everything had changed. Those memories would stay with him forever, an unshakable part of his life. Jake Turner's early years in Ohio were marked by chaos and confusion. Growing up in a modest home with a mother who worked long hours just to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads, Jake often felt neglected. His grandmother, too, had her hands full and couldn't provide the structure or attention Jake desperately needed. Left to his own devices, Jake quickly fell in with the wrong crowd. By the age of 13, he was already running wild at night with a group of similarly rebellious friends. They had one thing in common: anger born from fractured homes and a shared growing realization that life wasn't as it should be. Jake's story took a darker turn when he learned the truth about his father. His dad hadn't simply abandoned the family. He had been murdered. This revelation fueled the fire inside Jake. For the first time, he understood that life wasn't just unfair, it was cruel. His anger turned into a wild need for revenge against a world he felt had wronged him. The grief over his father's death, combined with the ever-present tension in his life, pushed Jake deeper into rebellion. With his schoolwork suffering and his sense of purpose dwindling, Jake found solace in destruction. He and his friends spent their nights vandalizing derelict houses, breaking windows, kicking in doors, and ripping down fences. It wasn't just for fun, it was a way to release the simmering anger and frustration they felt. Often, they didn't just target abandoned properties. They'd throw bricks through windows of occupied houses, indifferent to the damage they caused. For Jake, it became an almost addictive release. But as time passed, The thrill faded, and the weight of his actions began to settle on him. By the time Jake reached 16, he and his friends had earned a reputation in their small Ohio town as troublemakers. School was no longer an option. By that age, Jake had dropped out, abandoning any hope of finishing his education. The streets became his school, and the lessons learned there were harsh and unforgiving. But the night his friend was wrongfully sent to a juvenile detention center for a crime he didn't commit, Jake realized how far he had strayed. That was the wake-up call he needed. The idea of facing even more serious consequences for his reckless behavior terrified him, and the fear of losing his freedom, something he had taken for granted, was enough to force him to reconsider his life. Jake knew he couldn't go back, but he was determined to find a way out. He cleaned up his act, put down the bottle, stopped smoking, and removed his nose ring. He began searching for a job despite the fact that his lack of work experience made it seem like a long shot. That's when he found Walmart. It was a chance, and even though Jake wasn't sure he'd get hired, he wrote a letter explaining his situation. To his surprise, the store manager gave him a shot, offering him a probationary position. This was Jake's turning point. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for the first time in years, he felt the hope of a fresh start. After Jake secured the job at Walmart, his life slowly began to change. The stability of having a routine and earning a paycheck provided a stark contrast to the chaotic and unpredictable days of his past. At first, it was hard to adjust. The simple task of showing up to work on time felt like a monumental challenge compared to the easygoing, anything-goes attitude he had grown accustomed to. But the sense of responsibility, however small it seemed, gave him something he hadn't had in years: a purpose. For the first time, he was accountable for something other than his own failures. The hours spent stocking shelves, organizing products, and serving customers were physically exhausting, but mentally grounding. Jake found solace in the steady rhythm of the work. In those early months, his coworkers didn't make it easy for him. Their wariness was palpable. Most of them viewed Jake with suspicion, unsure if he was just another dropout trying to pretend he had turned a corner, or if he would slip back into old habits. Jake was familiar with that look. He'd seen it in the eyes of people who only knew his past, the reckless teenager who wreaked havoc with his friends and didn't give a damn about anyone or anything. But Jake was determined to prove them wrong. Every day he showed up early, stayed late, and worked harder than he ever had in his life. Slowly, the walls his coworkers had built around themselves began to crumble. They started to see him not just as the guy who used to make trouble, but as someone who was trying to build a future for himself. His supervisor noticed Jake's efforts, and after a few months, began to give him more responsibilities. Jake was cross-trained as a cashier, a position that held a lot more responsibility than simply stocking shelves. This recognition, small as it was, meant the world to him. It wasn't just about getting more hours or a paycheck. It was about proving to himself that he could be more than the sum of his past mistakes. For once, someone was willing to give him a chance, and he wasn't about to blow it. The change in Jake's demeanor didn't go unnoticed. He had gone from a sullen, distracted kid to a hardworking and dependable employee. The routine of the job provided a sense of normalcy that Jake hadn't had in years. He began to look forward to his shifts, knowing that the paychecks would keep coming, and with each one, he was building something more than just financial security. He was starting to build his identity outside of the chaos that had once defined him. No longer was he the angry lost teen. Now he was just Jake, the guy who worked hard and kept his nose clean. But with the stability came an unease. It wasn't just the pressure of proving himself to his coworkers anymore. It was the growing realization that he had to face the consequences of his past. While Jake worked hard to maintain his job and his sobriety, the ghosts of his youth still lingered in the back of his mind. The adrenaline rush from breaking things, from acting out, was long gone, but the deep-seated anger still simmered beneath the surface. And even though he was making strides in creating a better life for himself, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his past might come back to haunt him. One day, while stocking shelves in the cleaning aisle, Jake had the unsettling sense that someone was watching him. At first, he brushed it off. People stared sometimes, it wasn't unusual. But when he looked up, he noticed a man standing at the end of the aisle, his gaze locked onto Jake with a strange intensity. It wasn't the usual glance of curiosity that people often gave him. No, this was different. The man didn't seem to be looking at the products on the shelves. He was focused solely on Jake. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Jake, feeling uncomfortable, offered a polite smile and said, "Can I help you with anything today, sir?" The man smiled back, but it wasn't the warm, friendly smile Jake was used to. It was something colder, more distant. He simply replied, "No, thank you," and turned to walk away. Jake felt a chill down his spine. Something about that encounter didn't sit right with him, but he shrugged it off. After all, Walmart was no stranger to weird customers. Still, when the same man reappeared a few days later standing in the same aisle staring at him again, Jake's unease deepened. This time he was more direct. "Can I help you with something?" He asked, his voice more guarded than before. The man just smiled again, said, "No thank you," and walked off. It wasn't until later that Jake realized this wasn't just a strange coincidence. Something about the man's behavior made him feel like he was being watched, and it left a lingering discomfort in his gut. Little did Jake know this was only the beginning of a series of unsettling encounters that would soon turn his world upside down. As the days passed and Jake settled more into his routine at Walmart, he began to feel like he had finally found some semblance of stability. His coworkers were no longer giving him the cold shoulder, and even his supervisor had started to trust him with more responsibilities. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. The job wasn't glamorous, but it provided a sense of accomplishment that Jake hadn't felt before. Every week the paychecks grew, and with that, the hope of a future beyond the past he was desperately trying to leave behind. But as much as Jake tried to focus on his new life, there was something that wouldn't let him go: the strange man who kept appearing at the store. The first few encounters had been odd but harmless. However, as the days went by, Jake began to feel more and more uneasy about the man's persistent presence. It wasn't just the staring. There was something about the way the man would lock eyes with him, almost as though he were studying Jake, waiting for something. Each time the man would approach him as if he needed help, but then would simply walk away after a brief exchange. No questions, no requests, just a strange lingering silence between them that Jake couldn't shake. After the third encounter, Jake had finally had enough. He couldn't stand the man's presence anymore. As much as he tried to convince himself that he was overreacting, his instincts kept telling him something was wrong. This time, when the man appeared at the end of the aisle again, Jake felt the familiar unease crawling up his spine. This wasn't the random curiosity of a customer. It felt like something far more deliberate, as though the man was specifically seeking him out. With a sense of frustration and unease, Jake approached him. "Can I help you with something?" he asked, trying to sound calm, though his voice betrayed the hint of irritation he felt. The man smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was cold and almost knowing, like he had seen through Jake's carefully constructed facade. "No, thank you," he replied in a voice that was both polite and distant, his eyes scanning Jake from head to toe. Jake's heart skipped a beat as the man's gaze lingered. He quickly turned away, trying to get back to work, but the feeling of being watched didn't dissipate. It was as though the air itself was thick with the tension that had been building between them. And then, just like that, Jake felt it, a sinking sensation in his gut, a strange growing suspicion that he couldn't shake. Who was this guy? Why was he so intent on following him around? 4 days later, Jake found himself back in the same aisle, restocking the shelves with cleaning products. It had been an unusually quiet shift, and he had hoped for a break from the usual weirdness. But as he turned around to grab another box, there he was, the same man standing at the end of the aisle. It didn't take long for Jake to realize it was the same person, despite the brief gap between their encounters. A chill ran down his spine. He had been trying to tell himself that he was imagining things, that he was just being paranoid, but now there was no denying it. This man was following him. Trying to maintain his professionalism, Jake forced a smile and said, "Hello again, sir. You need help with anything?" He couldn't quite mask the edge of irritation in his voice this time, but the man just smiled back, nodding politely. "No, thank you." He repeated, his voice carrying that same strange detachment. He turned and walked off without saying anything else. Jake stood there for a moment, frozen in place, his mind racing. Something was definitely wrong. It wasn't just the man's behavior, it was the way he looked at Jake. The man had never asked for anything, never shown any real interest in the store. It was as if he was merely observing Jake, as if there was something more going on that Jake didn't understand. The unease Jake had been feeling since their first encounter was now undeniable. There was a palpable sense of danger lurking just beneath the surface, one he couldn't ignore anymore. When he mentioned the situation to a coworker, she shrugged it off, laughing. "Looks like someone's got a crush on you," she joked, but Jake couldn't laugh along. The casual way she dismissed it only made him feel more isolated. He didn't know what was going on, but something about this man's repeated visits felt far from innocent. And yet, Jake had no idea that these eerie encounters were just the beginning of something far darker. Little did he know that the man who had been quietly stalking him in the aisles of Walmart was far more than just a strange customer. His past, a past that Jake had long buried, was about to collide with his present in a way that would change everything. What began as an odd curiosity would soon turn into a terrifying reality, one that would force Jake to confront the consequences of his previous life and the ghosts he had hoped would stay buried. The strange encounters with the man at Walmart continued, and as they did, Jake found himself growing more and more uneasy. At first, he had hoped that the man was just some oddball customer with a tendency to linger a little too long in the aisles. But as the days wore on, Jake began to sense that something far more disturbing was unfolding. Every time the man appeared, it was in a different part of the store, and it always seemed like he was drawn to Jake, his eyes fixed on him like a hawk's gaze on prey. Each encounter left Jake feeling more uncomfortable than the last. But what unsettled him the most was the man's strange knowing smile. It was as if the man was aware of something Jake wasn't, and that unnerving feeling of being watched began to consume his every thought when he was at work. It wasn't just the man's persistent presence that bothered Jake, it was the unspoken connection that seemed to be developing between them. Every time Jake tried to engage the man offering help, the man would smile politely, but would always refuse, as though there was something more important than buying groceries on his mind. The way he looked at Jake, like he was reading him, studying him, made Jake feel like he was trapped in some sort of psychological game. The man's eyes were almost too familiar, like he was someone from Jake's past, but Jake couldn't quite place him. It was a growing mystery that gnawed at him, and no matter how many times he tried to dismiss it, the feeling of dread grew stronger. It wasn't until a week later that Jake began to understand the unsettling truth. He had been working his usual Saturday shift, covering for a coworker when the man appeared again. This time, Jake had reached his limit. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. He had to confront whatever this was. As the man stood at the end of the aisle, his eyes locked onto Jake's, as if drawn by some invisible force Jake couldn't hold back. He turned to face him, his voice tinged with frustration. "You need help with anything today, sir?" This wasn't the polite customer service voice anymore. This was Jake speaking from a place of irritation and confusion. The man just smiled, that same cold, unsettling smile that made Jake's skin crawl. "No, thank you," he replied, his voice flat and distant. But this time, as he turned away, Jake saw something different. There was a flicker of recognition in the man's eyes, something that didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just the man's gaze, it was the way he moved, the way he lingered before walking off. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a random customer. There was something about the encounter that felt too deliberate, too purposeful. Jake tried to push the thought out of his mind, but it stayed with him. The man had been in the store a few times now, and each time, Jake felt a little more trapped in a web of strange encounters. A few days later, Jake was restocking in the same aisle when the man appeared again. But this time, something was different. The man didn't approach him right away. Instead, he stood at the end of the aisle, his eyes still fixed on Jake. This time, however, Jake didn't wait for the man to approach. He took a deep breath and decided to confront him directly. "You've been in here a lot," Jake said, his voice steady but with an edge to it. "What do you want from me?" The man's response was calm, even eerily composed. "You don't remember me, do you?" The words hit Jake like a cold wave. Something about the way the man spoke made Jake's heart race. He had been trying to piece together the puzzle of this man's presence, but now he was more confused than ever. "What do you mean?" Jake asked, his voice thick with confusion and suspicion. The man smiled again, but this time there was no warmth behind it. "It's been a long time. You were just a kid when we last met." Jake's mind raced as he tried to place the face. His stomach churned as he searched his memory for some connection, but it wasn't coming. The man wasn't a customer who had simply passed through the store. Jake felt a knot tighten in his chest as he realized the truth. This man knew him. Somehow, they had crossed paths before, but when? And why did it feel like Jake had been marked by this encounter, as though his past was catching up with him in the most sinister way? The man took a step closer, pulling out his phone, but not to show Jake something on the screen, as Jake had expected. Instead, he looked at the phone briefly before returning his gaze to Jake. His hand, which had been holding the phone, now appeared scarred, as though it had been burned. Jake's eyes caught the marks on the man's skin, the pale pink scars that seemed out of place. His heart skipped a beat. "Do you know what degenerative myopathy is?" Craig the man asked, using Jake's full name for the first time. Jake froze. The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He didn't know what the term meant, but the fact that this man knew his name, his full name, sent a surge of panic through him. The man continued explaining the condition with unsettling detail. But Jake could hardly focus on the words. All he could think about was the fact that this man seemed to know something about him, something from his past that Jake had never fully understood. The longer the conversation went on, the more Jake realized that this wasn't just a chance encounter. This man had been following him, waiting for the right moment to confront him about something that had happened long ago. Something Jake couldn't remember, but feared deeply. The encounter left Jake with a feeling of dread that didn't go away after the man walked off. Something had shifted in Jake's world, and it wasn't just the man's presence that unnerved him. It was the feeling that his past, a past he had tried so desperately to leave behind, was finally catching up with him. The days following that tense encounter with the man at Walmart weighed heavily on Jake. He couldn't stop thinking about their conversation, especially the way the man had calmly spoken, as though he knew Jake intimately. There was something about the way the man had mentioned degenerative myopathy that lodged in Jake's mind. But it wasn't just the unfamiliar term that unsettled him. It was the fact that this man knew his name, his full name, and that was something Jake couldn't shake. Jake had spent so much of his life trying to outrun his past, but here it was rearing its ugly head in the form of a stranger who seemed to know far too much about him. The uncertainty gnawed at him, and with each passing day, his unease only grew stronger. After the man's cryptic remark, Jake tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting back to their interaction. He couldn't make sense of it. Why had this man singled him out? What was the connection between them? The more Jake thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. He had changed so much since his reckless youth. He had left behind the chaos of his teenage years, the vandalism, the fighting, and the constant tension. He had found a job, built some stability, and was slowly carving out a better life for himself. And yet, here was this stranger, someone from his past, forcing him to confront the one thing he had hoped to leave behind forever. Jake didn't mention the encounter to anyone at work. It felt too personal, too unsettling. And even though he was itching to talk about it with someone, he didn't want to sound paranoid. Maybe it was just a coincidence, right? Maybe the man was just a strange, lonely person who had taken an interest in him for no reason at all. But deep down, Jake knew that wasn't the case. He knew it wasn't a coincidence when just a few days later, the man appeared again. This time, Jake was stocking the shelves in the home goods aisle. He glanced up, and there he was, standing at the end of the aisle just like before. But this time, Jake's heart sank. The man's presence wasn't just unsettling, it was downright terrifying. Jake tried to ignore the man focusing on his task, but the feeling of being watched intensified. He turned to grab another box, his hands trembling slightly. His eyes darted to the man, and their gazes locked once again. This time, the man didn't even bother to walk up to Jake. Instead, he just stood there staring at him like he was waiting for something. Jake felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't let this strange game go on. Swallowing his nerves, Jake walked over to the man, his footsteps deliberate and measured. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice low but firm. His heart pounded in his chest, and he felt his palms begin to sweat. The man's eyes flickered as Jake approached, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he gave Jake that same cold smile, the one that made him feel like prey, not a person. "You really don't remember me, do you?" the man asked again, his voice softer this time, almost as though he were pitying Jake. The words hit Jake like a punch. It was as though the man had reached into his brain and plucked out his deepest fear, his past catching up with him. Jake's mind raced. "What do you mean? Where do I know you from?" he asked, his voice edged with frustration. The man's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't kind. It was knowing, like he was toying with Jake. "It's been a long time." "You were just a kid when we last met," the man said. And Jake's stomach dropped. His heart was hammering in his chest. He didn't know this man, but the way he spoke, so sure, so confident, made Jake question everything. Who was this man? And why was he saying these things? Jake's thoughts swirled, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't let this man see how much he was rattled. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jake said, trying to steady his breathing. But the man wasn't backing down. "You don't remember, do you?" He repeated, his voice colder now. "I guess that makes sense. You were just a kid, and it was years ago." The man's eyes burned into Jake's, his words hanging in the air like a thick fog. Jake's heart raced, the past bubbling to the surface. "Who are you?" Jake demanded, his voice rising slightly. But the man just gave him that same unsettling smile. "I'm the one who lost everything because of you," he said, his voice almost a whisper now, as though he were speaking a secret that only Jake was meant to hear. The words hit Jake like a truck. "You don't remember, but you were there, Jake. You were part of what happened." Jake's blood ran cold. He took a step back, his mind reeling as he tried to piece together what the man was saying. The world around him felt like it was spinning. The memories were starting to flood back, fragments of a time he had buried so deep within himself that he thought they were long gone. Was this man talking about the things Jake had done as a teenager? The destruction, the recklessness, the things he had tried to erase from his life. The man's words echoed in his head. "I'm the one who lost everything because of you." Jake's mind raced as he realized that the man wasn't just some random stranger. This was someone from his past, someone he had hurt, someone who had been affected by the chaos Jake had left behind. And now, years later, the consequences of his actions were staring him in the face. The man turned to walk away, but not before giving Jake one last piercing look. "You'll remember eventually," he said over his shoulder, his voice carrying a dark promise. Jake stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The fear that had been creeping in for weeks now had a name. It was his past, and it had come back to claim him. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in him the moment the man walked away. It was like the ground beneath his feet had shifted, and for the first time in years, he was faced with the consequences of his past, the very thing he had spent so much time running from. As the man's chilling words echoed in his mind, Jake's thoughts raced back to his troubled youth, to the anger and destruction that had consumed him for so long. He had hoped that his past mistakes, the ones that had caused so much pain, would stay buried, never to surface again. But the encounter in the Walmart aisle had torn open the old wounds he had tried so hard to forget. That night, Jake lay awake in his small apartment, the weight of everything pressing down on him. His mind was a blur of fragments, scenes from his past that he had long since buried. The memories of vandalizing homes, breaking windows, and causing chaos with his friends flooded his mind, each one sharper and more vivid than the last. He could almost smell the burning wood from the fires they had started, feel the rush of adrenaline as they'd run from the scene. He thought he had moved on from all of that. He thought he had changed. But now, with the man's words haunting him, Jake realized that no matter how much he tried to outrun his past, it was still there, lurking, waiting to come back. He replayed the conversation with the man over and over again, trying to piece it all together. "I'm the one who lost everything because of you." Those words, spoken so coldly, rang in his ears. Who was this person? How was Jake connected to him? The man had spoken as though Jake owed him something from long ago, but Jake couldn't remember. He wanted to believe that the man had mistaken him for someone else, that this was all some strange misunderstanding, but deep down, he knew better. The guilt gnawed at him. He didn't remember what had happened, but he knew he had been a part of it. In the days that followed, Jake's unease turned to paranoia. He couldn't go to work without feeling like eyes were on him, like the man was still out there watching, waiting. Jake had never been one to feel paranoid, but now it was as though the world had shifted and everything seemed off. His coworkers noticed the change in him too. He was more withdrawn, more distracted. He couldn't focus on his work. The steady rhythm of his job, which had once given him so much peace, now felt like a prison. It was as though every shelf he stocked, every customer he helped, only served to remind him of the man who had confronted him, the man who knew more about his past than Jake cared to admit. Jake tried to push the fear aside to focus on his life. Now, the stable, mundane life he had worked so hard to build. He had turned away from the wreckage of his youth, and he had made something of himself. But the man's words kept echoing in his head, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore them, they refused to go away. He couldn't let go of the fact that there was some terrible truth about his past that he had yet to uncover. The weight of it hung over him, and he knew deep down that he couldn't move forward until he confronted it. But where would that confrontation lead him? And what would he find once he finally remembered? It wasn't just guilt that consumed him anymore. It was a deep, gnawing fear. Fear of what he might discover about himself. Fear of what he had done in the past. And fear of the man who seemed to know everything. Jake wasn't sure what to do next. But one thing was certain: the past was not done with him yet. Lucas Reamer was not the kind of young man who drew much attention. At 21 years old, he lived quietly with his grandparents in Allen Creek, a quiet suburb on the outer edge of Dallas, Texas. His neighbors knew him as the polite boy who mowed the lawn every Saturday and rarely missed trash day. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, and no outward signs of trouble. But beneath the surface, Lucas had become a vessel for something far more dangerous than anyone around him could see. Throughout his childhood, Lucas was described as mild-mannered and introverted. He was the kind of kid who kept to himself during recess, more comfortable with books and internet forums than with classmates. Former teachers remembered him as bright but distant, while classmates recalled his quiet demeanor and frequent blank stares in group settings. By high school, Lucas had grown increasingly withdrawn. He stopped participating in extracurriculars, and his once friendly manner gave way to a cold, irritable personality. Though he still lived with his grandparents after graduating, most of his time was spent in his room, glued to a laptop. Online, Lucas had been quietly absorbing a growing library of extremist ideas. Deep into anonymous forums and fringe message boards, he found a sense of validation and direction he couldn't find anywhere else. He began frequenting a website called Firewall 9, a chaotic digital underworld, notorious for hate-fueled manifestos and calls to action disguised as patriotism. It was in these dark corners of the internet that Lucas built a belief system around conspiracy, cultural resentment, and apocalyptic urgency. No one in Allen Creek saw it coming. The boy next door, quiet and forgettable, had begun planning something monstrous, something he believed would make him seen, remembered, and justified. Allen Creek might have been quiet, but Lucas Reamer's final destination was anything but. Nearly 650 miles to the west lay Raven Springs, a sun-baked border town clinging to the edge of Texas like a final thought. With its dusty streets, chain restaurants, and a skyline dominated by freight trucks and strip malls, Raven Springs was the kind of place most people passed through without remembering. But to Lucas, it had become a symbol. The city sat just across the border from Juarez, Mexico, its population a blend of cultures, languages, and livelihoods. For someone steeped in online rhetoric about invasion and cultural erosion, Raven Springs wasn't just a city, it was a target. What looked like a normal community to most became, in his eyes, a flashpoint for some imagined war. As the summer heat rolled in, Lucas wasn't just planning a trip. He was setting a course for violence disguised as ideology, aimed squarely at the heart of the American Southwest. Just after midnight on August 6, 2022, Lucas Reamer slipped out of his grandparents' home in Allen Creek and quietly loaded a duffel bag into the trunk of his silver sedan. The night was still, the streets half-lit and empty, and there was a strange calmness to the moment, almost like the world itself was holding its breath. He didn't leave a note, didn't say goodbye. What Lucas had planned, he believed, required no explanation. Over the next 10 hours, he drove nearly 650 miles westward, cutting across the long, flat spine of Texas under the cloak of darkness. He stopped only twice, once in Abilene and again near Fort Stockton, buying gas, energy drinks, and a pack of mints. At one stop, he used the restroom, stared at himself in the mirror for several seconds, then walked out without washing his hands. As the sun began its slow climb behind him, Lucas merged onto the outskirts of Raven Springs. The desert light bathed the city in hues of orange and gold. But to him, everything looked artificial. Sterile buildings, soulless billboards, parking lots that stretched like runways. He didn't go directly to Metromart. Instead, he spent nearly an hour cruising through the east side of town, taking back roads and side streets as if mapping out some invisible strategy. He passed taco stands, school zones, dusty playgrounds, and tire shops with signs in both English and Spanish. He didn't play music. He didn't open the windows. He just drove. Eventually, he parked a few blocks from Metromart and sat in his car with the engine running. He scrolled through his phone, rereading bookmarked forum threads and screenshots. His hand trembled slightly as he tightened his grip on the steering wheel. For a brief moment, he thought about turning around, going home, erasing everything. But the thought was fleeting. The ideology that had taken root inside him, the sense of mission, of warped justice, was too deeply ingrained. As sweat formed on his brow from the rising desert heat, Lucas finally turned off the ignition and looked toward the distant shape of Metromart, barely visible over a row of swaying power lines. In his mind, this wasn't just the end of a road trip. It was the beginning of something he believed the world would never forget. Lucas didn't head straight into the Metromart. Instead, he parked his car in a far corner of the lot, well beyond the reach of security cameras, but close enough to observe the main entrance. He sat still for a few minutes, his eyes fixed on the glass doors where early shoppers came and went. He watched a woman push a stroller toward the store, followed by a teenager in a soccer jersey and a man in dusty work boots with a bag of return items. Nothing about the scene looked threatening, just another warm Saturday morning in a border town. But to Lucas, every moment felt heavy with purpose. After a few more minutes of surveillance, he stepped out of his car, walked into the store, and began wandering the aisles. He passed by toys, home goods, and pet supplies with a slow, deliberate gait. Nothing about his demeanor suggested aggression, but something about him raised quiet suspicion. A loss prevention associate began watching him from a distance, taking mental notes, as Lucas wandered near the electronics, then into produce. It was then, almost like trying to disarm suspicion, that Lucas picked up a single apple and walked it to the front. He paid in cash, declined a receipt, and walked out. Outside, he leaned against a concrete column and ate the apple slowly, never taking his eyes off the parking lot. By the time he finished, Lucas had made up his mind. He returned to his car, wiped his hands on his shirt, and reached for the laptop stashed in his back seat. At exactly 10:15 a.m., he connected to a mobile hotspot, opened a browser, and posted a thread on Firewall 9 titled, "It's Time." 5 minutes later, he uploaded a PDF manifesto titled The Hidden Truth, a 6-page screed laced with paranoid conspiracies, pseudo-history, and an explicit call to action. Although moderators scrambled to take it down, copies spread fast. But Lucas wasn't watching. He had already begun fastening the chest rig to his torso, feeding nylon straps through plastic loops with robotic focus. His eyes, once uncertain, now stared toward the store with unnerving calm. At exactly 10:23 a.m., Lucas Reamer stepped away from his car, now clad in a chest rig holding multiple fully loaded magazines. His AMR-10 semi-automatic rifle, an imported Romanian variant of the AK platform, hung from a shoulder strap, its matte black metal glinting faintly in the desert sun. He adjusted the sling, tightened the straps, and took one last deep breath. With no hesitation, he began walking toward Metromart. A soft breeze stirred the parking lot dust, catching plastic bags and flyers in midair. The store, already bustling with weekend shoppers, stood unaware of what was coming. Near the entrance, a fundraising table had been set up by a local girls' soccer team, the Raven Comets. Wearing matching red jerseys, the young women smiled and waved at passers-by, holding up signs and donation jars. Parents stood nearby in folding chairs under a pop-up canopy, chatting and sipping iced coffee. A few feet away, a woman in her late 50s pushed a cart full of bottled water toward the automatic doors. Lucas raised his rifle. The first shot was clean and quiet in its precision, striking the woman in the back before echoing across the parking lot like a thunderclap. She crumpled mid-step. Chaos erupted. The fundraisers froze for half a second, disbelief locking them in place. Then, Lucas turned toward them and opened fire. The pop, pop, pop of the AMR-10 rang out in brutal rhythm. Screams broke through the air. Girls scattered, diving behind tables, dropping posters and donation jars as bullets tore through nylon and flesh. A father lunged to shield his daughter and collapsed under the weight of 2 rounds. It was over in seconds. The front of the store, once alive with chatter and laughter, was now a scene of carnage and silenced bodies lying in still unnatural positions. Inside Metromart, the shooter's presence triggered a code brown Walmart's emergency term for an active shooter. A manager shouted instructions while staff members scrambled to usher people toward exits and stockroom hiding spots. Alarms sounded faintly in the background. Some customers dashed through emergency exits, bolting toward the strip mall next door. Others ducked behind checkout counters, crouched in the aisles, or pressed their backs to freezers and hoped to vanish into the shelves. Lucas entered through the front doors just after 10:26 a.m. His movements were calm, methodical, almost eerily detached. He shot an elderly man who attempted to flee toward the dairy section, then pivoted and fired on a couple near the coin machine. A cashier screamed and ducked behind her register. He ignored her. His focus seemed fixed on people moving, people scrambling, people afraid. That fear, it seemed, energized him. He advanced into the produce area, then through the self-checkout zone. He spotted a family near the in-store bank, a father holding his son, trying to pull his wife behind a display of canned beans. Lucas fired. The father collapsed, and the mother screamed, shielding her child with her body. Witnesses later described the shooter's demeanor as blank expressionless, like someone going through a routine task, rather than committing a mass murder. He did not shout slogans. He made no announcements. There was no spectacle, no performance. Just bullets. By 10:29 a.m., he had circled through the heart of the store and moved toward the eastern exit. Emergency sprinklers had gone off, and a haze of smoke from discharged fire extinguishers hung in the air. Some shoppers, who'd managed to hide in walk-in coolers or staff offices, waited in frozen silence, unsure whether the nightmare had passed or was still unfolding. Lucas stepped outside again at 10:30 a.m., the sun now directly overhead, casting harsh shadows across the blood-streaked pavement. He paused for a moment, scanning the lot. Dozens of people were still fleeing, some helping the injured, others screaming names of loved ones they'd lost sight of. He spotted a couple trying to crawl under their vehicle. He raised his rifle once more, fired 2 shots, and watched them drop behind the car. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, he stopped. With at least 21 people dead or dying, Lucas turned and walked back to his car. He didn't run. He didn't look back. He placed the rifle on the passenger seat, started the engine, and slowly drove toward the nearest intersection. His hands didn't shake. His face remained still. In his mind, the mission had been accomplished. The world he believed would now be forced to hear what he had to say, even if it was written in blood. As the sirens wailed and chaos swallowed the parking lot behind him, Lucas Reamer drove with eerie calm through the quiet streets of Raven Springs. He didn't try to flee the city or ditch the weapon. Instead, he headed west toward Sun Hill and Canyon View, a major intersection not far from the crime scene. There, standing beside a police motorcycle, a Texas Ranger and a Raven Springs patrol officer appeared to be discussing the situation unfolding across town. Lucas pulled into the left turn lane, put the car in park, and slowly stepped out with his hands raised in the air. The officers turned toward him, unsure what to make of the young man approaching with surprising composure. "I'm the one who shot up Metromart," Lucas said, almost like reciting a line he'd practiced. He was arrested on the spot. At the station, Lucas waived his Miranda rights and gave a full confession. He admitted to deliberately targeting Latino Americans and said he had been planning the attack for weeks. He revealed that he'd purchased the AMR-10 rifle and 1,000 rounds of hollow point ammunition online in June. When asked why he did it, he simply directed investigators to the manifesto he had posted hours earlier on Firewall 9, titled The Hidden Truth. The document was a rambling diatribe filled with conspiracy theories, racial grievances, and deeply paranoid ideology. Lucas expressed admiration for past mass shooters, particularly those who had targeted minorities. He claimed to be defending the country from cultural infiltration, warned of economic collapse due to automation, and blamed corporations for exploiting natural resources. While the language was disjointed and filled with contradictions, the intent was unmistakable. Lucas believed he was starting a war, and though his demeanor was flat and effectless, the horror he unleashed had already spoken louder than any words ever could. In the days that followed, prosecutors moved swiftly. Lucas Reamer was formally charged with 23 counts of committing a hate crime resulting in death, 19 counts of attempted murder, and additional charges related to the unlawful use of a firearm in an act of domestic terrorism. From the beginning, it was clear that this case would be treated as one of the most significant acts of racial violence in recent American history. During his first appearance in federal court, Lucas waived his right to a bond hearing and entered a plea of not guilty. His attorneys, however, hinted at an emerging strategy, a plea based on mental incompetency. They argued that Lucas had suffered from undiagnosed mental illness for years, referencing his growing social isolation, obsessive online behavior, and a reported history of auditory hallucinations. During preliminary hearings, they revealed he was being treated with antipsychotic medication, and that at the time of the attack, he had been experiencing a state of psychosis. Prosecutors, while acknowledging the mental health evidence, remained firm. This was a premeditated act, fueled by ideology, not delusion. Lucas had carefully selected the location planned, his route acquired weapons and ammunition, and posted a manifesto. This wasn't the chaos of a broken mind, it was the calculation of hatred. Then, in an unexpected move in early 2024, federal prosecutors announced they would not pursue the death penalty, citing the strength of the mental illness defense and a desire to avoid a protracted legal battle. Just weeks later, Lucas changed his plea. He admitted guilt to 90 federal charges, including hate crimes, terrorism, and mass murder. At sentencing, when asked by the judge if he felt remorse, Lucas barely nodded. He was given 90 consecutive life sentences, one for each count, a legal way of ensuring that he would never again breathe free air. In the weeks following Lucas Reamer's sentencing, Raven Springs became the epicenter of a nationwide outpouring of grief, reflection, and solidarity. While the national headlines soon turned to other stories, the people of this tight-knit border town refused to let the tragedy dissolve into memory. In a profoundly moving gesture, Julian Ortiz, a 65-year-old man who had lost his wife Maria in the attack, announced that her funeral would be open to anyone who wished to attend. He explained to local reporters that Maria had always believed in community and inclusion principles Lucas had sought to destroy. On the day of the service, over 1,000 people from across the United States arrived to pay their respects. The funeral home was overwhelmed with floral arrangements, handwritten cards, and silent tears from strangers who stood shoulder to shoulder in unity. But it wasn't only in words and flowers that people responded. 1 week after the shooting, Daniel Chavez, a marathon runner from Juarez, Mexico, crossed the border and ran 23 miles through the streets of Raven Springs, 1 mile for each life lost. Dressed in black and carrying a small Mexican and American flag side by side, he ended his run at the Metromart parking lot, now transformed into a makeshift memorial, covered in candles, photographs, and hand-painted signs. In the months that followed, local leaders and community members worked together to establish a permanent space of healing. In August of 2023, the Raven Healing Grove was dedicated in the heart of Ascaret Park, just 2 miles from the site of the tragedy. The memorial features 23 engraved stones beneath flowering mesquite trees, each stone bearing the name of a victim. Visitors are encouraged to leave notes, sit quietly, or walk the stone path that winds through native desert flora. Then, in December 2023, the U.S. Department of the Interior officially designated the grove as a national memorial, ensuring that its story would never be forgotten. In a world overwhelmed by division and noise, Raven Springs responded with grace, resilience, and remembrance. The healing didn't come easily, but it came seated in sorrow and watered by the unwavering belief that love must speak louder than hate. As visitors quietly walk the winding path of the Raven Healing Grove, many pause to reflect not only on the lives lost, but on the deeper questions the tragedy stirred about identity, ideology, and how easily hate can fester in silence. Yet even in the face of such darkness, the community's response became a testament to what endures. It is not the manifesto or the violence that echoes through the trees, but the notes left in trembling handwriting, the flowers laid by strangers, and the names spoken aloud with reverence. In Raven Springs, remembrance became resistance, and grief became resolve. We hope today's story moved you, made you think, or helped you see the world a little differently. If you found this content meaningful, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. Unsettling, thought-provoking, and true. Every bit of your support helps us continue uncovering and sharing the hidden, haunting, and powerful narratives that shape our world. Thanks for watching and for being part of this journey.